They didn't know who was sitting across the courtroom when they walked in that morning. My father straightened his tie. My mother smoothed her skirt. Their lawyer shuffled his papers with the confidence of a man who believed this was already over, and then he looked up. The color drained from his face so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts in a hospital parking lot, at 2 a.m, with a 23-year-old woman sitting on a curb with a cardboard box of her belongings and nowhere to go. That woman was me. My name is Claire. And for most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard enough, loved fiercely enough, and gave everything you had to the people who were supposed to matter most, they would show up for you when it counted. I believed that because my parents told me so. They said it at church every Sunday. They said it at the dinner table. They said it in Christmas cards they signed with little hearts. They were wrong. Or maybe they just never meant it for me. I grew up in Denton, a mid-sized city in North Carolina that was small enough that everyone knew your family name, and large enough that you could still disappear into it if you needed to. My father was a regional manager for a logistics company. My mother taught piano lessons out of our living room 3 afternoons a week. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable. The kind of comfortable where you never worried about the electric bill, but you also never talked about money at the table because it wasn't polite. I was their only child. And for a long time, I thought that meant I was precious to them. I was 23 when everything fell apart. I had just finished my first year of nursing school, working double shifts at a diner on weekends to cover what my scholarships didn't. I was exhausted in the way that only people who are building something from the ground up understand, the good kind of exhausted, the kind that comes with a plan. I had a boyfriend named Derek, who I had been with for 2 years, who told me he loved me and meant it, until the morning I told him I was pregnant, and he looked at me like I had just handed him a problem he hadn't asked for. He was gone within the week, blocked on everything. I never heard from him again. I told my parents on a Sunday evening in October, sitting at their kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea I couldn't drink because my stomach wouldn't settle. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times. I had prepared for their shock. I had even prepared for their disappointment. What I had not prepared for was the silence that followed, not the kind of silence that means someone is thinking, but the kind that means a decision has already been made. My father set down his fork. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He said that I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it, but that I would not be living with it under his roof. He said there were standards in this family. He said that he had worked his whole life to build something respectable, and he would not watch me dismantle it. My mother said nothing. She picked up her fork again. I sat there for another minute because I could not make my legs work. Then I went upstairs, packed what I could fit into 2 bags and a cardboard box, carried them to my car, and drove out of their driveway. My father did not come to the door. My mother turned the kitchen light off before I reached the end of the street. I drove to a parking lot outside a 24-hour pharmacy and sat on the curb because I didn't know where else to go. I was 23 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, and I had $47 in my checking account. Derek was gone. My parents were gone. I had 2 friends from nursing school, but they both had roommates and tiny apartments and their own fragile situations, and I was too ashamed to call them at 2 a.m. and explain what had happened. I sat on that curb for a long time, and then I called the one person I should have called first. My Aunt Rosemary was my father's older sister by 7 years, which meant she had grown up watching my father become the person he was, and she had made her peace with it a long time ago. She lived 40 minutes outside of Denton in a white farmhouse with green shutters, on 2 acres of land she kept mostly wild, with a vegetable garden in the back and a porch that wrapped all the way around the house. She was 61 years old, recently retired from 30 years as a high school biology teacher. And she was the kind of woman who had seen enough of life to know that most problems that feel unsurvivable at 2 a.m. are survivable by noon. She answered on the second ring. I didn't even finish explaining before she said, "Get in the car and come here. Right now. Don't stop for anything." I drove those 40 minutes crying so hard I had to pull over twice. When I finally turned down her gravel driveway, her porch light was already on and she was standing at the top of the steps with a blanket and a look on her face that I had never seen directed at me before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even just love. It was something fiercer than that. It was the look of a woman who had already decided she was going to fight for you before you even asked. She wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and walked me inside and made me sit at her kitchen table, and she put a bowl of soup in front of me and she said, "Eat first, then talk." In that order, I ate, then I talked. She listened to everything without interrupting once, and when I was done, she folded her hands on the table and said, "Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay here as long as you need. Your room is the second door on the left. Tomorrow we're going to figure out your insurance and your prenatal appointments and whether your school has a leave of absence policy. Tonight you're going to sleep. I started. You can," she said. "And you will. That's not up for discussion." I stayed. Aunt Rosemary had never married and had no children of her own, and she had built a life that was quiet and deliberate and entirely hers. She grew tomatoes and green beans and 3 kinds of peppers. She had a bird feeder outside the kitchen window that she took very seriously. She read actual physical books, and she had opinions about them. She drove a truck that was older than I was, and she said it had more integrity than most people she had met. She was, without question, the best person I had ever known. She came to every prenatal appointment. She helped me research the leave of absence policy at my nursing school, and when they initially said my gap semester might affect my financial aid, she drove to campus with me and sat in the financial aid office and very calmly explained the situation until they found a solution. She never made me feel like a burden. She never made a single comment about Derek or about my parents that was cruel, even though she had every right to. When I apologized, which I did constantly in those first months, she would just look at me steadily and say, "There is nothing to apologize for. You're doing the work. That's all anyone can do." My son was born in June, on a Tuesday, during a thunderstorm that knocked the power out for 6 hours across the county. Aunt Rosemary held my hand through the whole thing. She was the first person to hold him after me. She looked down at him and said, quietly, almost to herself, "Well, hello there. We've been waiting for you." I named him Marcus. My parents did not call when he was born. I had told myself I wouldn't expect them to, and I had mostly believed that. But there's a difference between telling yourself not to expect something and the actual feeling of the phone not ringing. Aunt Rosemary noticed. She brought me tea and sat next to me in the hospital bed and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Their loss is permanent. Your gain is standing right there in that bassinet. Keep your eyes on what you've got." I did. I went back to nursing school 8 months after Marcus was born. Aunt Rosemary watched him on the days I had class. On the days I had clinical rotations, we arranged a split system with a daycare 2 miles from her house that she had personally vetted, visited 3 times, and cross-referenced with the state licensing board before she would agree to it. I studied at the kitchen table after Marcus went to sleep, with her reading in the armchair across the room and occasionally sliding a plate of crackers and cheese in my direction without being asked. It took me an extra year, but I finished. The morning I passed my NCLEX boards, the licensing exam that meant I was officially a registered nurse, I called her from the testing center parking lot before I even started the car. She picked up on the first ring. When I told her, she was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, and then she said, "I knew. I've known for a long time, but it's good to hear it out loud." I got a job at a large regional hospital in Charlotte, about 90 minutes from Aunt Rosemary's house. It was far enough that I couldn't make the drive every day, but close enough that Marcus and I were there almost every weekend. She was the one who taught him to garden. She was the one who built him a birdhouse for his 5th birthday and then spent an entire Saturday helping him paint it. She was the one he called when he had a bad dream, and I was on a night shift and his babysitter didn't know what to say. She was, in every way that mattered, his grandmother. Over the next several years, I advanced. I went back for my master's degree part-time, studying healthcare administration, because I had realized early on that I cared not just about the patients in front of me but about the systems that either helped or failed them. I became a charge nurse, then a nurse manager. Then I moved into a director of nursing role at a mid-sized hospital in the greater Charlotte area, overseeing a team of over 100 staff across 4 units. I did not talk to my parents during any of this. There had been one phone call from my mother, about 3 years after I left, that lasted less than 4 minutes. She said that she and my father had been thinking about me. I said that was interesting. She said they hoped I was doing well. I said I was. There was a pause. She said maybe someday we could have a proper conversation. I said maybe. She said she had to go. I said goodbye. That was it. I will not pretend it didn't hurt, because it did. It hurt in a specific and persistent way, like a low-grade ache that you learn to work around but never fully ignore. But I had learned something in the years since that parking lot curb. I had learned that the people who choose you not because they have to, not because of blood or obligation, but because they look at who you are and decide you're worth showing up for, those people are the architecture of a real life. Everything else is just noise. Aunt Rosemary was my architecture. She was diagnosed with congestive heart failure when she was 68. She told me on a Sunday afternoon in the garden, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used to tell me the beans were coming in well. She said the doctors had given her a reasonable timeline if she managed it carefully. She said she planned to manage it very carefully because she wasn't finished yet. She managed it for 4 years. She kept her garden. She kept her birds. She kept reading. She watched Marcus grow from a quiet, serious 7-year-old into 11-year-old who could identify 17 species of migratory birds by their calls and who had, according to his teacher, a gift for explaining things to people in a way that made them feel understood. She told me once, sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, that she thought he was going to be the kind of person who made other people's lives better just by being in them. "He gets that from you," I told her. "He gets it from both of us," she said. "That's how it works." She died on a Wednesday in March, 2 months after Marcus turned 11. I was holding her hand. It was a quiet morning, and the birds were loud outside, and the light was the particular pale gold of early spring. She had asked me the night before to make sure the bird feeder was filled before I left. I had told her I would. She left me everything. I hadn't known the full extent of it until her attorney called me 3 weeks later. Aunt Rosemary had been careful with money her entire adult life, had invested steadily for decades, had paid off her house and her land 30 years ago, and had, over a lifetime of disciplined and quiet financial management, accumulated an estate valued at just under $2 million. She had no other family she was close to. She had a small number of friends who received personal items and modest bequests. The house, the land, the investments, the savings, all of it came to me and Marcus. I sat in that attorney's office and I did not cry. I had used up my tears in the hospital and in the days after, in the garden with my hands in the soil she had spent 40 years tending. In that office, I just felt the weight of what she had done. Not the money, the intention. The deliberate, years-long act of making sure that we would be okay. Making sure that the life she had helped me build could not be taken away. I thanked the attorney. I drove home, I told Marcus. He sat very still for a while. Then he said, "She really loved us, huh?" "Yeah," I said. "She really did." 6 months later, I received a certified letter. My parents were contesting the will. Their argument, as laid out by their attorney in language that was formal and bloodless and made my stomach turn, was that Aunt Rosemary had been suffering from a progressive cardiac condition that affected her cognitive function in her final years, and that her decision to leave her estate in its entirety to me represented an undue influence on my part over a vulnerable elderly woman. They were claiming that I had manipulated my aunt. They were claiming that the estate rightfully belonged to the broader family, meaning them. They were seeking a full reversal of the bequest and a redistribution of assets. I read the letter 3 times. My father had not spoken a meaningful word to me in 12 years. My mother's last real communication with me had been that 4-minute phone call nearly a decade ago. Neither of them had ever met Marcus. Neither of them had attended Aunt Rosemary's funeral. Neither of them had sent a card, a flower, or a single word when she died. And now they wanted her money. I will not describe in detail what I felt in that moment because some things don't translate well into words, and because I think anyone reading this already knows. I called my own attorney the next morning. Her name was Patricia, and she had been my attorney for several years, handling various professional and personal legal matters as my career had advanced. She listened to everything I told her, asked several precise questions, and then said, in the calm, professional tone I had come to deeply appreciate, "Claire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Okay," I said. "Are you prepared to fight this all the way?" I thought about Aunt Rosemary in the hospital bed, asking me to fill the bird feeder. I thought about her at my kitchen table in the middle of the night when Marcus had a fever and I was terrified. I thought about her holding his hand on the first day of kindergarten, standing in for me because I had a shift I couldn't trade, and she had said, without hesitation, "I'll be there." "Yes," I said. "All the way." What my parents' attorney did not know what my parents apparently had not bothered to find out in the 12 years they had spent not knowing anything about my life was that 18 months earlier, I had been appointed to a position on the Regional Hospital Oversight Board, which carried with it a formal quasi-judicial designation in certain administrative proceedings. And 4 months before the letter arrived, I had accepted an interim appointment to serve as a hearing officer for the state's healthcare regulatory body, a role that required formal appointment by the governor's office and came with the administrative title of adjudicative officer, which in formal legal correspondence and in courtrooms was addressed with a specific professional courtesy. The courtesy was judge. It was not a lifetime appointment. It was not a criminal court, but in the jurisdiction where my parents had filed their civil action, in the specific procedural context of an estate challenge, it was enough. It was more than enough. My attorney filed our response. The case was assigned to a courtroom in Charlotte. A date was set. I did not tell my parents what I did for a living. I did not tell their attorney. I had no obligation to, and Patricia confirmed that there was no procedural requirement for me to volunteer that information in advance. The discovery process would surface it. It always does. But they had not done their homework, and that was not my problem to solve. The morning of the hearing, I wore my dark navy suit and the small pearl earrings Aunt Rosemary had given me for my nursing school graduation. I arrived early. I was sitting at the respondent's table reviewing documents with Patricia when my parents' attorney came through the door, briefcase in hand, talking to an assistant, not looking up. He looked up when he reached his table. He saw me. He saw the documents in front of me. He saw my name on the placard, and then some internal calculation happened behind his eyes that I watched happen in real time, the recognition, the rereading, the understanding of exactly what kind of error his clients had made. He straightened his jacket. He cleared his throat. "Good morning," he said carefully. "Doctor, I'm sorry. Should I be addressing you as—" "Adjudicative officer is the formal title," Patricia said pleasantly, not looking up from her own papers. "But we're not here in that capacity today. Today she's just the respondent. You can call her Miss Claire." He nodded once. He sat down. He did not look at my parents, who were sitting in the gallery, and who had, I noticed, gone very still. I did not look at them. I looked at the papers in front of me. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Patricia had come prepared in the way that prepared means when someone has had decades to care about what they're protecting. She presented Aunt Rosemary's medical records from her cardiologist, from her primary care physician, and from 2 independent assessments conducted in the final year of her life, all of which confirmed that her cognitive function remained fully intact until the final weeks. She presented documented evidence of my parents' absence, no contact records, no visits, no correspondence with the decedent in over a decade. She presented a letter that Aunt Rosemary had written and had notarized 2 years before her death, addressed to her estate attorney, affirming in her own words, in her own voice, that the disposition of her assets was intentional, considered, and represented her wishes without qualification. My parents' attorney did his best. It wasn't enough. The judge presiding over the hearing, an actual judge, a different person than me, which Patricia had quietly ensured through a procedural motion filed 2 weeks in advance, ruled in our favor on every count. The will stood. The estate transferred as Aunt Rosemary had intended. My parents' petition was dismissed. My father stood up when the ruling was read. I thought for a moment he was going to say something. He didn't. He just stood there for a second, and then he sat back down, and something in the line of his shoulders reminded me, against my will, of a much older man than the one I remembered. My mother was crying, quietly, looking at her hands. I did not speak to them in the courtroom. I signed the necessary documents. I thanked Patricia. I walked out into the November afternoon and stood on the courthouse steps and called Marcus, who was at school, and left him a voicemail that just said, "Everything went the way it was supposed to. I'll tell you about it tonight. I love you. Go focus." 3 weeks later, I got a text from an unknown number. The area code was Denton. It said, "We'd like to talk, if you're willing. We can come to you, or anywhere you choose. We understand if you say no." I stared at it for a long time. I thought about what it would feel like to say no. I had imagined that moment many times over many years, and in most of those imagined versions, it felt like power, like finally having the thing I had been denied, but sitting with the actual text in my actual hand, in my actual life, the life that Aunt Rosemary had helped me build, that Marcus had grown up inside. that I had constructed brick by careful brick out of nothing but necessity, and the stubborn refusal to stop it didn't feel like power. It just felt like an old weight that I was tired of carrying. I texted back a date and the name of a diner near my office. Public. No trowel. 1 hour. They were there when I arrived, sitting across from each other in a corner booth. My father looked smaller than I remembered, which surprised me. My mother looked up the moment I came through the door. I sat down across from them. The waitress came. I ordered coffee. My father started to speak. He said they had made a terrible mistake. He said they had been wrong, and they had been wrong for a long time, and that they had told themselves stories to avoid admitting it. He said that finding out what I had become, not from me, but from their attorney's panicked phone call the night before the hearing, had been like waking up from something. My mother said she had thought about me every day. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When they finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I want you to understand something. I don't need an apology to be okay. I have been okay. I have Marcus, and I had Aunt Rosemary, and I built a life that I am proud of, and none of that required you. You missed it. Not as a punishment, you just missed it. Because you weren't there." My father nodded. He wasn't going to argue with that. "I'm not going to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen," I said. "I'm not going to tell you we're family like nothing occurred, but I'm also not interested in spending the rest of my life maintaining a wall. That takes energy I'd rather spend elsewhere." My mother asked about Marcus. I looked at her for a moment. Then I took out my phone and showed her a picture of him last summer in Aunt Rosemary's garden, kneeling in the dirt next to the tomato cages, holding up something he'd just picked with the particular pride of a kid who grew it himself. She looked at the picture for a long time. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like himself," I said. "But yeah, a little like me." I left after 45 minutes. I didn't make any promises and they didn't ask me to. We said goodbye outside the diner, and my father reached out and put his hand briefly on my arm, and I let him. On the drive home, I took the long way, the route that goes past the exit for Denton, past the turnoff I used to take toward Aunt Rosemary's farmhouse, past the gas station where I once stopped to cry on a drive that felt like the end of everything and turned out to be the beginning of everything that mattered. The bird feeder at her house now belongs to the family who bought the property. I hope they fill it. I think about that sometimes. I think about her all the time. Marcus asks me occasionally, in the way that 11-year-olds have of asking the things that actually matter, whether it's possible to miss someone and still be okay. I tell him yes. I tell him that missing someone who loved you well is one of the least painful things there is, once you learn to hold it right. It means you had something real. It means you were seen. He thinks about that for a while. Usually. Then he goes back to whatever he was doing. He's going to be fine. He already is, actually. We both are.